Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Chapter 1. Down the Rabbit Hole. Alice had nothing to do. She and her big sister were sitting on a riverbank. Her sister was reading a book with no pictures. It looked very boring. Alice was thinking about making a daisy chain when a white rabbit ran by. "Oh dear! Oh dear! I shall be too late," the rabbit said. Then the rabbit took a watch out of his vest pocket. He looked at it and hurried on. Alice jumped up and ran across the field. After the rabbit. The rabbit popped down a large rabbit hole under a hedge. Alice popped down after him. The rabbit hole went along like a tunnel for some time. Then suddenly it dipped. Alice didn't have a moment to stop before she was falling down what seemed to be a well. Either the well was very deep or Alice fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time to look around. Along the walls were bookshelves and cupboards. Maps and pictures hung on pegs. Down, down, down. Would the fall never end? "I wonder how many miles I've fallen," Alice said. She tried to figure it out based on what she had learned in school about the size of the earth. Finally, Alice gave up. The numbers were too big. Down, down, down. There was nothing else to do, so Alice began talking out loud. She pretended she was talking to her cat, Dinah. Then she just started to make up silly things. "Do cats eat bats? Do bats eat cats?" she said. "Dinah, did you ever eat a bat?" Suddenly, thump, thump. Alice landed on a heap of sticks and dry leaves. She was not a bit hurt. She jumped up and looked around. She saw the white rabbit running down another long tunnel. He was quite far away. Alice ran like the wind to catch up with him. "Oh, my ears and whiskers, it's getting late," he said. Then he dashed around a corner. When Alice turned the corner, there was no sign of him. She was in a long, low hall. It was lit by a row of lamps hanging from the ceiling. There were doors all around the hall. Alice. And down, trying all the doors. Every went up, one was locked. Finally she stood in the middle of the hall. How was she ever going to get out again? She noticed a three-legged table. It was made of solid glass. On top of it was a tiny golden key. Maybe the key belonged to one of the doors. Alice tried the key in each of the doors. But either the locks were too large or the key was too small, for the key wouldn't open any of them. However, Alice didn't give up and went past the doors again. This time she found a low curtain she hadn't seen before. Behind the curtain was a little door, only 15 inches high. She tried the golden key in the lock. It fit! Alice opened the door. It led to a small passage not much larger than a rat hole. She knelt down and looked along the passage. There at the end was the loveliest garden she'd ever seen. It had pretty fountains and rows of bright flowers. Alice longed to go out of the dark hall and into the garden. But she could not get even her head through the door. And even if I could get my head through, then what about my shoulders? Alice thought. Oh, if only I could make myself close up like a telescope. I wonder how I could do it. You see, so many strange things had happened to Alice now that she thought anything was possible. Alice wandered back to the table. She hoped she would find another tiny key, or a book about closing up like a telescope. This time a little bottle stood on the table. A label was tied around the bottle's neck. On it were the words "Drink Me" in large letters. Well, Alice was not going to do that in a hurry. No, I'll look and see if it is marked Poisson, Alice said to herself. She knew terrible things happened to children who didn't follow simple rules. She was sure that if you drank from a bottle marked poison, sooner or later it was going to make you sick. The bottle was not marked poison. So Alice tasted it. It tasted very nice, like a mix of cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, toffee, and buttered toast. Alice quickly finished it off. What a curious feeling, said Alice. I must be closing up like a telescope. And so she was. Alice was now only 10 inches tall, just the right size for the door to the garden. She ran to the door, but it was locked. The golden key was back on the table. Alice could plainly see it through the glass top, now far above her. Alice tried to climb a table leg, but it was too slippery. She tried and tried, until she was too tired to try anymore. Then she sat down and cried. When she stopped crying, she looked around again. A little glass box lay under the table. Alice opened the box. Inside was a very small cake. The words "Eat me" were written in raisins on the top. I'll eat it, said Alice. If it makes me grow larger, I can reach the key. If it makes me grow smaller, I can creep under the door. Either way, I'll get into the garden. And I don't care which happens. She ate a little bit. Then she held her hand over her head and said, "Which way? Which way?" To her surprise, she stayed the same size. So she ate up the rest of the cake. Chapter 2. The Pool of Tears. Curiouser and curiouser, cried Alice. I am opening up like the biggest telescope ever. Goodbye, feet. She said this because when she looked down at her feet, they seemed very far away. Alice kept growing until her head hit the ceiling. She was now more than 9 feet high. She took the golden key from the glass table and ran to the garden door. Poor Alice! There was no way she was going to get through the door. She could only see the garden by lying on her side and looking through the door with one eye. She was mad at herself for crying, but she couldn't help it. She wept gallons of tears. She stopped at last when she heard little footsteps. Alice dried her tears quickly. She was lying in a puddle of tears 4 inches deep. The footsteps belonged to the rabbit. He was now quite dressed up. He had a pair of gloves in one hand and a large fan in the other. As he ran, he talked to himself. Oh, the Duchess, the Duchess. She will be angry if I am late, he said. Alice felt quite desperate, so she spoke to the rabbit. If you please, sir, she began in a low, timid voice. The rabbit started. Then he dropped the gloves and the fan and ran away as fast as he could. Alice picked up the fan and gloves. The hall was very hot, so she fanned herself. She kept fanning until she looked down at her hands. She saw that she had put on one of the white rabbit's gloves. I must be growing small again, she said to herself. Alice went back to the table to measure herself. It seemed she was about 2 feet tall and getting smaller. Maybe it was the fan that was making her shrink. She dropped it just in time to save herself from shrinking away completely. That was a narrow escape, Alice said. And now for the garden. But the garden door was locked again, and the key still on the table. Things are worse than ever, she said. I was never this small, never. As Alice spoke these words, her foot slipped. In another moment, splash! She was up to her chin in salt water. Her first thought was, I've fallen into the sea. Then she remembered her tears. It wasn't the sea at all. It was a pool of her own tears. I wish I hadn't cried so much, she said. As Alice tried to find her way out of the pool of tears, she heard a loud splashing a little off. She swam nearer, thinking it must be a whale walrus or a hippopotamus. It was a mouse. Do you know the way out of this pool? Alice asked. The mouse just looked at her. Maybe it didn't understand English. So she tried talking in French. But the only thing she knew how to say in French was "Where's the cat?" So that is what she said. The mouse leaped out of the water in fright. Oh, I beg your pardon, cried Alice. I forgot that mice don't like cats. Not like cats, cried the mouse, quivering all over. Would you like cats if you were me? Perhaps not, said Alice. But I think you would like Dinah, if you knew her. The mouse glared at her. How about dogs? Alice tried. There is a nice little dog that lives nearby. The mouse started swimming away. Mouse, dear, Alice called, do come back. I won't talk about cats or dogs. When the mouse heard this, it turned around. Let us get to shore, then, it said to Alice. By now the pool was getting quite crowded. Swimming about were a duck, a dodo, an eaglet, and many other creatures. Alice led the way, and the whole party swam to shore. Once they were out of the water, the animals talked about how to get dry. Finally the mouse said that he would tell them a story that would surely dry them off. All the animals were quiet. Then the mouse told them a long and very boring story about politics. It is not drying me at all, Alice said in the middle of the story. I am as wet as ever. Everyone agreed with Alice, so the mouse stopped his story. The dodo suggested racing until they dried off. Around and around the animals and Alice ran until the dodo declared the race was over. The dodo was right. They were all dry. Someone asked the dodo who had won. He thought for a while, then said, everyone has won, and all must have prizes. But who is going to give the prizes? The animals asked. Why, she, of course, said the dodo, pointing to Alice. The animals crowded around Alice. Prizes! Prizes, they all called. Alice dug into her pocket and pulled out a box of candy. Luckily, there was one piece for each winner. But what about Alice? The mouse said that she should have a prize as well. So Alice found a thimble in her pocket. She gave it to the dodo. We beg you to accept this humble thimble, the dodo said to Alice. He gave her back her thimble. Alice thought it was all very silly, as indeed it was. Then all the animals hurried off to their homes. Alice was left alone. She wondered how she was ever going to get back to her home. She was about to cry again when she heard the patter of little feet. Chapter 3. The Rabbit Sends in Little Bill. It was the White Rabbit. He was walking back and forth as if he was searching for something. Oh, my paws and whiskers, he said. The Duchess will have my head. Where can I have dropped them? Alice knew that the rabbit must be hunting for his gloves and fan. She looked around for them. Everything seemed to have changed after her swim in the pool. The great hall with the door and the glass table had vanished. Soon the rabbit saw Alice. "Why, Mary Ann, what are you doing here?" he asked. "Run home and fetch me a pair of gloves and fan. Quick, now!" Alice was so frightened, she ran off at once in the direction the rabbit pointed. "He doesn't know who I am," she said to herself. "But I'd better take him his fan and gloves if I can find them." As she said this, she came upon a neat little house. On a brass plate were the words W. Rabbit. Alice walked in without knocking and went upstairs to hunt for the gloves and fan. She hoped she would not run into the real Mary, and Alice found her way to a tidy room. There was a table at a window. A fan and 3 pairs of tiny white gloves lay on the table. Alice picked up the fan and 1 pair of gloves. Then she saw a little bottle near the looking-glass. There was no label on it, but Alice decided to drink it anyway. "Something interesting happens whenever I eat or drink anything here," she said to herself. "I do hope I grow again." Before Alice had drunk half the bottle, she felt her head pressing against the ceiling. "That is quite enough," she said, putting the bottle down. "I wish I hadn't drunk so much." But Alice went on growing and growing and growing. She barely fit in the little room anymore. Finally, she had to stick 1 foot up the chimney and 1 arm out the window. It was very uncomfortable. "I can't do any more than this," Alice said. "I wonder what will become of me now." Luckily for Alice, the magic was done and she stopped growing. But she was stuck. "It is much nicer at home," Alice thought, "where I am not always growing and shrinking and being ordered about by mice and rabbits. When I used to read fairy tales, I thought none of it was true. Now here I am in the middle of one. There ought to be a book written about me. When I grow up, I'll write one." Alice kept thinking things like this until she heard a voice outside. "Mary Ann." "Mary Ann," said the rabbit. "Fetch me my gloves this moment." There came a pattering of little feet on the stairs. Then the rabbit pushed against the door to the room. But it wouldn't open because Alice's giant elbow was pressed against it. In the window, the "I'll go around and get rabbit" said. "That you won't," Alice thought. Alice waited until she believed she heard the rabbit under the window. Then she spread out her hand and made a snatch in the air. She didn't catch anything. But there was a little scream and the sound of breaking glass. "Pat! Pat! Where are you, you?" came the rabbit's angry voice. "Come and help me." There were sounds of more broken glass. Then the rabbit said, "Now tell me, Pat, what's that in the window?" "It's an arm," said a new voice. "That must be Pat," thought Alice. "An arm, you goose," said the rabbit. "Who ever saw one that size? It fills the window." "Sure it does," said Pat. "But for all that, it's still an arm." "Well, it has no business being here," said the rabbit. "Take it away." Alice heard a lot of whispering. She spread out her hand and snatched the air again. This time there were 2 little shrieks and even more breaking glass. Alice waited some time without hearing anything. At last came a rumbling like cartwheels and the sound of many voices talking. Alice tried to hear what they were saying. She made out the words, "Where's the other here, ladder?" "Why, Bill's got it." "Bill, tie them together." "That's it." "Oh, It's coming down. Someone's got to go down the chimney. Bill's to-go got master says you have to go down. Here, Bill. Down the chimney. Poor Bill, thought Alice. Even so, she knew she had to do something. She drew her foot down the chimney as far as she could and waited. When she heard a scratching about in the chimney, she gave a sharp kick. There goes Bill, came a chorus of voices from outside. Then the voices talked about what to do next. After a minute or two, Alice heard the creatures outside moving. A shower of pebbles rattled through the window. You'd better not do that again, Alice yelled. Instant silence fell. Alice was surprised to see that the pebbles on the floor were all turning into little cakes. If I eat one of the cakes, I will grow bigger or smaller, Alice thought. And since I can't get any bigger, then I'll have to get smaller. So she swallowed one of the cakes. Right away she began shrinking. When Alice was small enough to fit through the door, she ran out of the house. A crowd of small animals and birds stood around a lizard. That must be Bill, Alice thought. The creatures saw Alice, and all made a rush at her. She ran off as fast as she could, and soon found herself safe in a thick wood. The first thing I've got to do, Alice said to herself, is grow to my right size. And the second thing I've got to do is find my way into that lovely garden. It was all very well to have such a plan, but carrying it out was another thing